Welcome to Ask the Experts, the very first session from the IADSA. We welcome everyone here and we look forward to a great afternoon of discussions. Today is the first session that we have had of Ask the Experts. It's a new initiative from the IADSA and it aims to assist members with questions with real-time answers. And we've got a panel of experts which we think will do justice to this session and the questions that you ask. Today's session in particular is focused on the Social and Ethics Committee. And we're very fortunate to have a fantastic and really experienced panel. I must say though that any views or experiences shared by our speakers are garnered over a career path of many years and should not be attributed to any particular company or board that they are now serving on. So it's really over many years of work and experience with Social and Ethics Committee and within their careers that they have garnered this sort of experience and expertise. So our esteemed panel today, I'm going to start with introducing them with Dr. Simo Lushaba. Dr. Lushaba, I'm going to continue calling him Simo, if that's okay, Simo, instead of Dr. Lushaba each time. Is a non-executive director on several listed boards, particularly Harmony and Cashbuild, and he's the chair of the Harmony Board, Social and Ethics Committee Board and a member of the Cashbuild Board. He's also a chairman of the board of Specom and Pick It Up Johannesburg. Well, he was previously, and that shows his insight into public sector experience. He's also a member of the Presidential Review Committee of State-Owned Enterprises and an IADSA facilitator. Also joining us on the panel is Prof.Deon Rossouw. Many of you might know him through some of our training here at the IOD. Prof. Rossouw, or Deon, as I'll continue calling you, is the CEO of the Ethics Institute, a member of the Kin Committee for Corporate Governance in South Africa, a chartered director, as well as the chairman of the Social and Ethics Committee Forum of the IODSA. He's also the author of the Social and Ethics Committee Handbook. Third on our panel is Mrs. Ntombi Langa-Royds. Again, I'll be continuing with calling you Ntombi if you don't mind. A non-executive director serving on a plethora of listed companies. Redefine Properties, the chair of the Social and Ethics Committee. Impact Limited, chair of the Social and Ethics Committee. Marianne Roberts Holdings, chair of the Social and Ethics Committee, as well as chair of Europe Assist in South Africa, as well as Ntombi also serves on the Social Ethics Committee of Kumba Iron Ore and sits on our Kin Committee subcommittee dealing with remuneration. So Ntombi's experience is not just limited to social and ethics, but spreads further and wider to remuneration too. And that could be quite pertinent when it comes up, if any of the questions come up now about the different board committees. I just want to note to our audience, please, that you must know that this session is about having a general discussion with our experts, where you can ask your questions and on this particular governance topic around Social and Ethics Committee. Our experts are sharing their knowledge and expertise, but the content of the session does not constitute professional advice or formal legal advice. Anybody who's got a particularly contentious matter or matter requiring legal advice should rather seek that legal advice or advisory advice if it's a more in-depth, longer discussion. I'm now going to kick off and say hello to our panel. I'm going to share here so that we can all see each other and say welcome to our panel and thank you very much for joining us today. I have two burning questions that I've seen coming up with regards to social and ethics committees. And I would really like to know from your experience how you have dealt with these particular issues. I'm going to pose these two questions to you now, and then I'd really like if any of our audience has any questions. Well, I'm not hoping, I'm expecting some questions from our audience, and I would really like it if you could please put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. You will see it, the Q&A functions, and we also have a chat function. So just keep in mind, questions in the Q&A. If you would like to say something or commentary, you're welcome to do it in the chat, but keep questions in the Q&A. I will at some point, possibly, if you would like to verbally ask your question, I can unmute you and allow you to speak. And then you can pose your question if it's a particularly long one and you don't want to be typing it up. Or if you are more comfortable with writing it down, pop it in the Q&A. Okay, my two burning issues to my experts. What do you do, or what has been your experience as a Social and Ethics Committee chair or member of the Social and Ethics Committee when it comes to the relationship between the Social and Ethics Committee and other board committees? When there's an overlap, or there's a question that's related to both, or a work area that's related to both, how, in your experience, has that been handled? And then my second question, and maybe we can deal with it the first one and then go into the second one, is around the legitimacy of the Social and Ethics Committee. How do you build on that legitimacy to really give the Social and Ethics Committee traction? I am going to now ask if there's anyone, any particular panel expert would like to go first, or should I just go from left to right on my side? Deon, you look ready.
Yes, thank you, Julia, and a very warm good afternoon on a fairly chilly day here in Pretoria. Starting with the overlap between different committees, I think it is quite expected. If you think that the governance of the social and ethics performance have been on the cards for decades, in other words, very long before social and ethics committees were required by the Companies Act as of the 1st of May 2012, when that requirement became effective. So obviously, before that, different committees looked to aspects that are now falling within the mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee. And therefore, if a governing body does nothing and just keep on doing as they were doing before the Social and Ethics Committee became a statutory requirement, there obviously will be overlap. And when there's overlaps, it's a waste of time and a waste of effort, and it leads to a lot of frustration. And I often see that it also leads to turf wars, where committees say, but we've always attended to that. You are the new kid on the block, the Social and Ethics Committee. Why should this now fall under your mandate? So it is extremely important that there is a bit of a spring cleaning in the boardroom. And the best way that I've seen that companies handle this is they call a meeting where the company secretary and the chairperson of the board calls the different committee chairpersons together in a meeting and say, okay, here's the issue. Say, for example, employee safety and health, or if we take the King for guidance, fair remuneration. Whose domain is this? But I think it's also important to understand that sometimes there is duplication, and when there's duplication, we should sort it out and make a call who is responsible for what. But then it's often also a case that different committees would look at the same matter without duplicating the discussions in the various committees. If you take something like corruption, an example that I often use in my training, and it's a real life example from a real company, you have one report, like a corruption report, going to the Social and Ethics Committee, it goes to the Risk Committee, it goes to the Audit Committee. The very same report, but you have three very different conversations. When the Social and Ethics Committee look at that corruption report, they would typically look at the ethical culture of the organization and whether there is sufficient measures in place to prevent corruption from occurring. In other words, to create an organizational culture that is not conducive to bribery and corruption. When the Risk Committee would discuss that very same report, well, then it's a matter that they look at it from a risk perspective and they ask, is this a sufficiently important area to be included within our risk register? And do we have risk mitigation plans in place for that? While when that same report goes to the Audit Committee, they might make a call on whether a forensic investigation is required and whether that investigation should be an internal or external one. So there you can see the same topic, three different conversations and absolutely no duplication. And what we also find in terms of a practice that has emerged now over the last almost a decade now, is that in some cases there would be a cross membership between, say, a social and ethics committee and a risk committee, exactly to say when the social and ethics committee, for example, are moving into a risk conversation to say, stop it. We have our risk committee meeting later this afternoon or tomorrow or next week, and we will pick up on this conversation. So in that sense, I think it isn't a fatal flaw. It is something that can be fixed. Let me be very short on the second one, the question on the legitimacy of a social and ethics committee. In other words, how do you give it traction? If you approach a social and ethics committee as a compliance exercise, forget about it. You will never get traction. Nobody has interest. Nobody has energy for that. But the moment that you link the social and ethics committee mandate to the strategy of your organization, that is when synergy starts to appear. And I've seen wonderful examples of companies, especially now also in the time of COVID, or in the time of the social unrest that we are going through, where the social and ethics committee became extremely active and is in a constant conversation with the board on matters that are absolutely crucial for the survival of companies, but also for their success and their sustainability. And the moment that you link the work of the social and ethics committee with the purpose, the strategy, and the performance of the organization, I think that is when there's energy, when there's traction, where there is huge appreciation for the difference that a social and ethics committee can make.
Thanks, Deon. That's great. Simo, what has your experience been, and what is your insight? You're on mute, Simo.
In terms of the overlaps, it really is something that the chairs of the committees have to attend to. Of course, the chair of the board could also be involved, but it starts with your terms of reference, in terms of how you forecast the committees in their terms of reference, so that they fully understand what their mandate entails. Deon has made a good example with respect to corruption. You could also look at it from the perspective of ethics, in that the Social and Ethics Committee will be responsible for ethics management in the organization. How are we actually managing ethics to establish an ethical culture? The Risk Committee will look at ethical risks, both positive and negative ethical risks, and the Audit Committee will look at assurance in terms of the ethics. You could also look at it from a stakeholder management, because it's one of the areas where you find that there are overlaps, and the stakeholder management will be a responsibility of the Ethics Committee, Social and Ethics Committee, but other committees will also be looking at specific things that are being carried out with stakeholders. So there will be work that is getting done that either is in partnership with the stakeholders or it's benefiting the stakeholders. For instance, your relationship with labor unions, your HR committee could be looking at that. So it's a question of maturity in these committees to understand that they may be looking at the same issue, but from different perspectives, and talk about those perspectives, but also how you link the conversations. Because you have to organize your committees in a manner that these conversations feed to each other. Let's, for instance, look at the issue of a transgression, where it will point out to shortcomings, say, on your ethical management or ethics management. You do still need the audit committee to look at what do we do about this transgression? Do we investigate it, for instance? Do we ask the auditors what is the level of controls that we had? So there is no way that you expect the Social and Ethics committee now to be the one that deals with the control environment, because that is in the expertise of the audit committee. So it's not about the topic, it's not about the label or the title, it's about the conversation and which perspective. We're all trying to ascend to the same apex of the mountain, which will be the good name of the company, which will be the good governance outcomes. But we come from different perspectives, and it's important that we come from different perspectives, because no one person or committee is going to be able to do all of it. Otherwise, then they become a board. So the board delegates this. So it's in the art of delegation that you need to be able to clarify to each of these committees the focus areas of their conversations or discussions, so that they add value. Otherwise, you will think you have arrived because you've sorted out a matter, but no one has been looking at the root cause. No one has been looking at the systemic issues. No one has been looking at your control environment because you discussed the transaction that was in front of you. Boards must always remember, and committees, that we actually are overseers of a system. It's very important that we are effective and impactful on the system. And the system has many aspects and has many angles. You don't want committees or boards that become a system themselves. So they're focusing on the transaction, they are moving with the waves, and they are not able to oversee the ocean. You should always keep sight of the ocean. And for you to be effective in addressing the entire ocean or forest, you've got to have ability to look at different angles. So instead of being in competition, committees should be complementary through their conversations on similar topics. Yeah. On the legitimacy issue, it's a very important discussion, and I'm not so sure we will be able to do justice to it in one afternoon. But suffice to say that the existence or the bringing about of the Social and Ethics Committee in the first place was out of discomfort or unhappiness of the social partners when the Companies Act was being negotiated. They actually were so uncomfortable on all these areas that are now mentioned as key focus areas of the Social and Ethics Committee that they actually wanted to have space on the board for themselves to come and oversee those things, because they felt that boards were not doing a good enough amount of work in directing organizations. So when all is said and done, the results will tell. The trends need to start improving in as far as ethical culture of organizations is concerned, as well as the experience or the impact on stakeholder related issues. One of the things that we are struggling with in social and ethics, particularly, but generally in boards, is applying our minds and our measures at the level of impacts or outcomes. We're very happy to deal with output. So for instance, if we are providing water to the community, we are very happy to deal with how many taps have we put in a community of water. But what does that do for the community? Where are actually the impacts? For instance, a study that had been done some years back indicated that when you bring taps to within 200 meters of each household, absenteeism improves, not absenteeism, late coming improves by 30% for girl children at school. Because instead of running around doing the chores of fetching water, they are actually focusing on getting themselves ready on time to go to school because water has been brought closer. Now that's the experience of community. That's the impact on community. So instead of us going around doing projects and just measuring outputs, we need to be conscious of what is the impact. Sometimes the impact cannot be brought. For instance, let's talk about building schools. It's well and good to build a school or to put a library, but if you don't work on school management to improve the experience of learners, the amount of money you've spent building a school classroom is actually not being justified by the quality of results that the school produces. So the Social and Ethics Committee needs to be looking in that space and making sure that instead of being marketing driven, when we do these programs, we are actually impact driven. So in some cases, we must work together. So if I'm the builder of schools, I should work with, for instance, an organization that brings in training, education, and improvement of teaching and learning, school management. I must also maybe work with somebody who is in the sports arena of school management, so that the children are developed, the learners are developed holistically, not just in terms of sitting in the classroom. Then the work you are doing to improve that school has an impactful outcome on the society. And for me, those are the things that will determine our legitimacy. And yeah, I think the jury is still out in that regard.
Thanks, Simo. Ntombi, you serve on several committees across on the board committees on some of the organizations that you are an NED for. What is your experience on this?
Thank you, Julie. Afternoon, everybody. I nearly said morning. My mind is still in the morning. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I think it's, a lot of what my colleagues have said is so very true, but I think the crux of it has to be the conversation that occurs between the chairpersons of the various committees, right? And the link to the strategy. Because at the end of the day, if we're not measuring all the things that we need to measure, right, or ensuring that there's a space where there's accountability around those issues, right, we're not doing anything, right? So my sort of historical perspective comes from a space which says boards functioned in a particular way, right? There was lots of elements that came out that were not being covered, and then they got thrown into the Social and Ethics Committee. Right? Hence, the agenda seems to be very, very large and very wide, right? However, when you look at it, you actually realize that it's not as wide as, it's not like just a big pool of nothing, right? It's got a focus, and it's got to link back to the strategy, which is, I think, the point that Deon made, right? So when we start to ask the question, what is the relationship between the SNE committee and other committees? For me, it's, what is the relationship between board committees? Not particularly SNE, because you have some companies who have got, for instance, an audit committee, which is an age-old audit committee. Everybody knows the audit committee has to be on the board, and some of them have got plain audit committees. Some of them have got audit and risk committees. Some of them have got audit, risk, and sustainability. And obviously they're talking financial sustainability rather than the other sustainability that has become quite topical these days. So, the conversation, I think, really is should be about what is it that the committees need to be doing for the board in alignment with the strategy. Right? And when we've got that answer, it is much easier to see where and what and how things are sorted out for the board's work, because as I think Simo said, subcommittees do the work of the board, right? The operational work. So yeah, so I just wanted to add that element to all the things that my colleagues have talked about. In terms of the legitimacy of the committee, again, right? Are we being legitimate when we are planting, when we are building schools and not ensuring that the facilities are the appropriate ones, right? The days of, for instance, in terms of CSI, which becomes part of the legitimacy, of handing out a check of 100,000 to somebody and saying we've done our bit are over, right? We need to go out there and find out what are the real issues. And our current situation in South Africa has shown us very clearly that we've got very, very big social issues that we need to deal with, right? And these social issues didn't start yesterday. They didn't start at the change of government. They didn't even start, at the previous government. There have been issues that have been societal issues in place for hundreds of years, right? And my personal view is that what has happened is that the corporate world has moved away from dealing with those issues, right? So almost sort of I don't know, wobbled their way out and started looking at other things, right? And not focused on these things and sort of said, well, there's an arm of society called government and they must deal with it, you know? But my view is that it's not a government only issue. It's everybody's issue, right? So if all of us get involved in those social issues, and if all of us do our little bit for those, in terms of trying to resolve those issues, everybody benefits, right? And I think that's, for me, the underlying philosophy that needs to come to the fore. I think that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thanks. So the IODSA has got quite a few reference documents and guidance documents on the Social and Ethics Committee, one of them being the Social and Ethics, the Ethics Institute Social and Ethics Committee Handbook, and we've got a terms of reference paper, and all on the IODSA's website. And I encourage our audience to go have a look at that and our fantastic new website. And the reason why I'm telling you about this is those documents are likely to touch on how to put a Social and Ethics Committee agenda together. But there's a question from Roland Edgar that I'd really like us to answer. He wants to know, what will a typical social and ethics agenda be? But I think to tweak that question is, what is most pertinent? What should be most pertinent on a Social and Ethics Committee agenda? Simo? Would you like to put something?
I think it's a fairly straightforward one. The Companies Act almost simplified that for most companies. There are things that you are required to actually address as a Social and Ethics Committee. Those will be things like customer relations, employment equity, Black economic empowerment. They are prescribed in law. So we've got about 6 or 7 things that are prescribed in law that we have to have on our agenda of the Social and Ethics Committee. Ethics, of course, CSI, corporate social responsibility and corporate social investments. Those are all the things that we need to oversee. I do not have the full list in front of me in that regard, but you also are key in looking at the reputation of the organization from a social and ethics perspective, in as far as the stakeholder management is actually one of them. I mentioned it earlier on as one of the things that you need to also address as a Social and Ethics Committee. So a typical agenda will look at those elements. Now, in some organizations, they look at them alternating with meeting to meeting. In other organizations, they look at all of them in one meeting, depending on where you position yourself as an organization and how you track your performance in those different areas. You would then determine the agenda, but your coverage, say the work plan, because the agenda comes from the work plan. The work plan has to address all of those elements.
Thanks.
Julie, we lost your audio there for a moment. Can I go?
Go ahead.
Okay. Roland, I don't think there's something like a typical Social and Ethics Committee agenda. There definitely is no one-size-fits-all approach for all companies. I think what matters is what Simo just said, that there are a certain prescribed mandates for the committee. And if we follow the lead of King 4, it has to do with economic issues, with workplace issues, with your external social issues, and of course also with your natural environment. Everything within the mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee fits into one of those 4 areas. But what matters now is, are you going to take a fixed agenda where you try to attend to everything within your mandate at every meeting of the committee? And that, in my experience, I also chair 2 Social and Ethics Committees, is close to impossible. It's almost impossible to do justice to your mandate and cover everything at every meeting. So therefore, what we typically find is, when you look at all the matters that the Social and Ethics Committee are responsible for, and you connect that with the purpose and the strategy of your organization, you would find that some things are more pertinent than others. I always say some things in the mandate are more equal than others. And those things that are more equal than others, that are more pertinent, that are material issues for the organization, they should get more airtime. So we know from our Social and Ethics Committee trend survey, by the way, Julie, there's another resource, the 2020 Social and Ethics Committee trend survey, and another very important resource is, of course, the Social and Ethics Committee practice note that was issued earlier this year by the King Committee. But if you look at that Social and Ethics Committee trend survey, you would see that most social and ethics committees meet 4 times a year. That is more or less the standard. Quarterly meetings of the committee. And what you now typically would do, if there are material matters, you most probably will attend to them at every meeting of the Social and Ethics Committee to keep a very keen eye on developments in that space. While other matters you might attend to only once a year because they are within your mandate, you have to comply. And you will just make sure that there's no serious issues there. So in that sense, it will differ from company to company, but then it also differ from industry to industry. Simo would know within a mining context, something like safety and health is all important. It must be very high on their agenda, and probably it will be a standing item on every meeting of a Social and Ethics Committee. However, when you go to something like banking, there are other issues. Treating customers fairly would probably be one of your main issues. And of course, the prevention of fraud and corruption would be issues that are very high on the agenda. So in that sense, I don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all approach. It should be linked, number one, to what is material to us, what is more equal for us than other things within the mandate of the committee. And of course, it's also linked to the industry, but it's also linked to where you are as an organization. If you are going through a scandal, you're just emerging from a scandal, there's no trust, then something like ethics would be top of mind. It would be on every meeting of the Social and Ethics Committee's agenda.
Ntombi, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I was going to say, the other element that actually does sometimes sort of decide what has to be dealt with in this committee is what we decide to call the committee. Right? So some organizations call it a Social and Ethics Committee. Some of them call it Social Ethics and Transformation. Some of them call it Social Ethics and Human Resources. So it's almost links to what I said before about a bit of a catch-all, right? And also, as Deon says, it depends very much on the industry that the organization is in. Because I also happen to know of an organization where safety, which traditionally is in social and ethics, is a completely different committee of its own, right? So it's a separate board committee because safety was an issue for the organization. So they decided that safety, health, and environment are in that in a committee of their own, right? So yes, I was just going to say it depends really on the agenda of the business, the sector that they're in, and what are their driving needs at that point in time. So I was just going to add something, Julie, to say, once you've decided what the name of the committee is, it may be useful just to sort of look at the various aspects of things like the King Commission principles. Where do we fit them? Where do we find the accountability? The UNDP principles, right? Where do we find the accountability, right? And then break them up into the social side or the ethics side or the transformation side, etc. And that will help with putting the work plan together for the year, as well as the agenda. And there are certain items which could be rolled over with the 4 meetings a year, right? Most of the Social and Ethics Committee meetings, either you have a situation where they go on for 6 hours or they go on for 2 hours, right? And so you'd need to, some of the items you'd have to roll them over and only see them once in a 6 meeting cycle or an 8 meeting cycle, which means 18 months to 24 months, depending on their relevance to the particular organization. Right? And I think for me, what has worked very well is the ability to say certain of these topics are not hot topics in this organization, but we can do it in a different way, where we build it in terms of the board, what do we call it, the whole development side of the board, right? So then we have papers. So we call in an ethics institution, for instance, you know, the ethics institute, we've had a couple of them come through and talk about ethics, you know, what's the gong, as they say, you know, what's going on in there. And we have a conversation around that, then we measure back into our organization, you know, and say, this is what's been said by an external expert. Are we doing those things? Aren't we doing those things? And if we aren't, what are we going to do about it? Or is it necessary? So that way you actually end up covering most of the things, if not all, right, in a specific period of time, and understanding that that period can be more than 12 months.
Thanks, Ntombi. Deon, I'm going to pose this question to you. You can deflect it to one of the other panel members if you want, but I'm going to ask you. When incorporating Social and Ethics Committee oversight activities into the annual integrated report, how much detail would ESG coverage get? How much would you include on ESG?
Okay, if you look at ESG, the E and the S are very much part of the mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee. In other words, environmental impact, and not only compliance, and there I totally agree with Simo as well, it should be about impact. So part of the statutory mandate, in other words, the legally prescribed mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee, deals with environmental impact. It also deals with social issues. In other words, impact on people, both inside your organization that we normally refer to as the workplace, but also people outside of the workplace. And the issue would be the G in ESG, because this is not a committee, it's a governance structure, but not a committee that is responsible necessarily unless the board mandates it to do it. And I know about a number of organizations where the board has mandated their Social and Ethics Committee to also take on the governance side. But when we talk about integrated reporting in general, I think this is probably one of the big untapped areas for Social and Ethics Committees. Because if you look what goes into the whole structure of an integrated report, if you look at the whole logic of integrated reporting, that integrated thinking where you consider all the capitals, but also all your stakeholders, that is very much the staple diet of a Social and Ethics Committee. And I think if you run an effective Social and Ethics Committee, when it comes to the time of compiling your integrated report, it really should be a harvesting process where you look at all the information that has come through the annual cycle, through the Social and Ethics Committee, but also through other board committees. And that information comes from management. It has been reviewed and critically assessed also by the Social and Ethics Committees and other committees. In other words, it's a form of combined assurance that has started to happen. And the ideal is that a lot of the information that passes through the Social and Ethics Committee in their reporting to the board is the very stuff that should go into an integrated report. I always say, one often finds that a company would almost invent a integrated report. They would get an outside consultant, get them in, and they would draft a story that I think often surprises people inside the organization. But if you do it properly, then the Social and Ethics Committee can add so much value and play such an important combined assurance role in ensuring that the right information related to your impact on the economy, on people, on the natural environment, on all your capitals, and on all your stakeholders have been properly reviewed on an ongoing basis by the Social and Ethics Committee.
Thanks, Deon. Ntombi, I've got a question for you that's coming. Oh, Simo, you'd like to add something there?
Well, yeah, let me also just emphasize.
Can I just add?
Don't be talking.
Yeah, I was just saying that I think that Deon, you're right about the integrated report. And the question very simply is, how much must you put in? My simple answer, as much as you can. My experience has been that, you know, the more you have, the more the analysts and issuers can read, right? The less questions you have on the AGM and the roadshow.
Ntombi is trying to teach us tricks of the trade to deal with the media and the analysts. I think I'm not going to tread into that one. But I wanted to say, Julie, it also has to go back to the issue of materiality. Because depending on the industry and the company that you are, you need to determine your materiality levels for these issues. Talk to your stakeholders, understand what is important to them. You can't report everything, but you must report the important issues. The level of detail you go to will also be to address what concerns your stakeholders. So when you are reporting, it's an external conversation with your stakeholders. It's important they find it valuable. So it's based on your understanding of the needs of your stakeholders, first of all, your materiality, but also you don't have to hoy all of it into the same report. You can cross-reference to what you've put on your website, for instance, so that those stakeholders that are interested in the detail, they've been directed in your integrated report where to find that detail, so that you also manage that your integrated report should not now turn into a 300-page report that no one is ever going to read. You must still keep it concise. It must be, in my rule of thumb, at least 60 to 80 pages, no more, should be sufficient. But the material information provided, direct us where to find it if it's not in the copy that you are distributing.
Thank you. Okay. So, Ntombi, I have a question for you. At this point, I also want to remind our audience that if you look in the chat groups, but don't get distracted because we've still got some great questions coming up, we have posted links to the Social and Ethics Committee guidance that we have all referred to here. So you can look through that, and I'm sure it will be sent to you in the post-event communication. Ntombi, in cases where social ethics committees are combined with HR and remuneration, how do you ensure that one does not overshadow the other?
Well, I must say, in my experience, most of the ones that I've seen have not been combined. So we've tended to have remuneration and HR, right? And then social and ethics and transformation, right? So yes, transformation may be considered an HR issue, but it has tended to fall in there, right? So I think again, it goes back to your work plan, right? And back to your sector, your sectorial divide, et cetera, and the focus and strategy of where you want to be, right? Because even if we did say transformation tends to be the conversation around how many Black people and how many women and how many isms do we have, right? When transformation is actually a bigger topic, right? And so where does that conversation happen? And that tends to happen in the Social and Ethics Committee, because then we start feeling guilty and calling it an ethics conversation rather than a social development conversation, right? So, all those things play a part, right? But I think that if one is objective, right, and unemotional in a number of those matters, you'll find that I'm actually struggling in my mind to think of a committee which has all of them in. I'm not aware of one. Maybe my colleagues has seen that, what you proposed, what you thought or suggested.
I think the real crux is the worry, and it's come up in one or two other questions, is that when things are combined, how do you ensure that social and ethics matters get the equal attention and the same balance? I think that's also what the crux of that question was.
That's the question. But as I say, the only way that I know of, or which I found works, is actually to make sure that the work plan, right? Whether you decide your work plan is a 12-month, 18-month, 24-month, and I think there's nothing wrong with even making it a 36-month work plan, right? As long as you cover all those items and you cover them adequately. And the question of adequacy can only be determined by the particular environment that you're in, right? So for one organization, perhaps in the financial services, corruption is a really big issue, right? And for another organization, corruption is not as big, right? So then when they get to the corruption conversation, rather than slot it in with a whole bunch of other things, they dedicate those 2 hours of the, the one 4 meeting of the year specifically to that and that alone. Or alternatively, they break it up and put it into some other place and call it a risk, right? And then it's discussed more in the risk committee than it is in the social and ethics committee. I think, as I say, it keeps going back for me to the strategy and what we want to achieve and what we want to enable to happen in terms of cultural development and cultural change and all those sorts of things. Because also, the conversations around ethics, often get uncomfortable, if I can put it that way, and I mean, I'll pick a topic now. Part of the conversation that we need to be having is LGBTIQ, right? And if you just say that in certain environments, woo, we're not talking about that. Our people aren't like that, and you say, you've got to talk about it, in the school sector, it's a very big conversation at the moment, because, that's where it's being, where people are more expressive, in another environment, particularly the sort of more established organizations, not talked about, we just put our blinkers on and it happens wherever it happens, but it doesn't happen here, et cetera, et cetera. And, we have to have that conversation. We have to engage that conversation. And I often say to people that if we can't talk LGBTIQ, right, and all the other parts of it that, this changing name, how did we start to talk about Black race? How did we start to talk about gender, right? Initially, it was very uncomfortable, but we had to talk about it, and if we can't get to the next stage, then there's something that's wrong in our culture. Then in fact, we're not being true to the values that we say we're part of, the famous values that talk about honesty and respect and all those sorts of things.
If I can just add something very briefly here, I think it's actually quite exceptional. At least that's what we found in our last Social and Ethics Committee Trend Survey, the 2021. We will soon have the results of the 2021 Social and Ethics Committee Trend Survey. But there we saw that in 85% of the organizations that we surveyed, the Social and Ethics Committee is a standalone committee. In other words, it's not combined with something else. A number of them call it by another name, such as a responsible business committee, but the mandate remains the same. It's actually exceptional to combine it with another committee. Ntombi's example of social ethics and transformation is not really an addition or combination with another committee. It's more emphasis that in the way in which we approach our agenda, transformation will always be a very material issue for us. So it's not really a combination of a social and ethics and a transformation committee.
Okay. Simo, do you want to add anything, or can I pose the next question?
Really, we can't hear you.
I said, Simo, would you like to add anything, or can I pose the next question?
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that whenever you combine, you must be very sensitive to the state of your organization. The assumption would be different if everything is in a steady state, there's no agency, there's no crisis. When you have certain topics that tend to have a degree of agency, they tend to overshadow those that don't have. For instance, take remuneration and nominations. remuneration issues, when they need to be discussed, they need to be discussed. You can't say, well, it's not in our work plan for this season, because then there will be a crisis that follows. So it's very important when the board is going to combine anything, that, as Ntombi was saying earlier on, you are mindful of how you structure your work plan, but cater for the things that have agency. Make sure also that they don't overshadow those things that don't have agency in their nature, because everything needs to be addressed. You actually ought to prevent a crisis. You don't want a board that moves from one crisis to the other, or a committee that is now discussing crisis after crisis. So it's very important to be sensitive to issues that are agent, and don't bring everything that has agency into one committee, because then that committee is going to be spinning around, not knowing where north, south, east, or west is.
Deon, as a co-author of the Social and Ethics Committee Handbook, I'm going to give you this next question. There's two parts to it. The first one, the person is asking whether it's acceptable to have an external professional, such as an attorney, chairing the Social and Ethics Committee, and is it desirable to have an entire board sitting on the Social and Ethics Committee?
Okay. The first question is the one about, is it advisable to have a totally independent person, like an attorney, you said, I think that was your example, to bring that person in to chair the committee? It is possible, but it's highly risky to do that. And it's highly risky to that person specifically. Remember, the moment that you sit on a committee of the board, you carry director liability. But the Social and Ethics Committee is a subcommittee of the board or the governing body. In other words, the final decisions are made not by the Social and Ethics Committee, but by the board, because the board make recommendations for approval to the board, which means that at the point where the decisions are made, that person would not be part of the conversation, because that person is not a board member. It's only, he or she is only brought in to chair the Social and Ethics Committee. So that is a danger, and when you take on a position like that, you really need to do it with your eyes very wide open, and be aware that you would carry liability for decisions taken by the board in which you did not participate. The other thing, of course, is when you bring in whoever you bring in, it is important also to make sure that you have the right mix of expertise. So if you have a Social and Ethics Committee consisting only of lawyers, obviously the conversation would go in the direction of legal compliance, and an important part of the Social and Ethics Committee statutory mandate, at least, is legal compliance. But it also goes way beyond that. And if you follow the King 4 guidance that we unpacked in that Social and Ethics Committee practice note, then it's much more about your impact on the society and your co-responsibility for the future of the society in which you operate. And that is all important. I think we've seen it with COVID, we've seen it with the unrest recently. A company is like a ship on the sea. If the tide comes in, then all boats lift. If the tide goes out, all boats go down. They sink lower. And that is so important when we think in an integrated way about our companies. The question on whether the entire board should sit on the Social and Ethics Committee begs the question, what's the purpose of the committee then? Because then you might as well have reserved the mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee for the board. I once seen an example, and please note this is bad practice, it's not good practice, but it was a smallish company in the agricultural sector. They only had 7 board members, so they decided that they will have only one board committee, which is called the Audit Risk Social and Ethics Committee. Now it's exactly the same 7 people sitting on that committee, so it's just a matter of reconstituting as either the board or the committee. So when you do that, you might as well say, no, the board will take on the entire responsibility. And it's possible to do that. King 4, of course, made a very important recommendation under Principle 8, where it said not only those companies who are caught by the Companies Act requirement should govern their social and ethics performance, all organizations, whether you are required by law or not, should govern their social and ethics performance, because it can potentially put you out of business if you don't do that. It is of strategic importance for attaining your purpose, for your performance, for your sustainability, that all organizations should govern their social and ethics committee. But it's up to you. If you're not required by law, who will be responsible for it? Is it a board responsibility? Is it given to an existing committee of the governing body? Or is it given to a dedicated subcommittee of the governing body?
Simo, go ahead.
Can I talk to that? Yeah. I fully agree with Deon's input in terms of the chair and the external member who is not a member of the board. Just want to emphasize that we must also remember that the game is a two-way street. It's not a one-way street. So it's not just about what the committee discusses and reports to the board. As the chair of a committee, it's important you are there at the board, you're listening to all other inputs and determining what is actually required out of your committee for things that come from the board itself and all the other committees. Now, you are going to be totally absent in those discussions, yet you are the one who is responsible for the agenda of the Social and Ethics Committee. So the nuances that are coming out of the discussions at the board are not going to inform your thinking, and you then are not going to get the areas of emphasis correctly because you are deprived of that information. So generally, I don't like boards that outsource their responsibilities. To be in conversation is one of the main responsibilities of being a board. You ought to talk about your matters in the organization. You ought to drive the organization in a certain direction. So you should be aware of all the parameters that you actually are using to drive this organization. You can't be blind to some just because your job is in a specific committee. Then you are not going to be an effective leader of the organization. So we need to always remember this. This is at the end of the day about the organization and the effectiveness of the board as a leader of the organization. So we shouldn't deprive the board of those insights and those views. People who are able to see all of that tend to make for good leaders of the conversations that are required across all the elements of the board. All these committees are there to assist the board in its oversight. They are not there by themselves and for themselves. So it's a two-way street. We need to always remember that.
Yeah.
And I think, Julie, is that there's nothing wrong with asking an expert to come in and give a view to the committee.
Yes.
Okay? But that individual is an invited member of the committee for that moment, né? And then they go away. So yeah, you know, and that's within the realm of the chairperson and how they wish to direct that conversation.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important because very often we want people as part of the conversation, and then we make them members of the committee. We should be very wise in our decisions there. If you want experts, by all means, but make that person an invitee. Either, and the same goes for some staff members of the organization. Don't make them members of your social and ethics committee. Make them standing invitees. In other words, they are there, they can give their inputs, they can participate in conversations, but they don't carry direct liability. And therefore we need to really heed the advice that Ntombi just gave there. Don't make them members if you only want their input on a specific matter.
Julie, I know you might be pressed for time, but let me just make this point. You are a conductor of an orchestra. There is a reason you must practice with your different instrumentalists. You can't just step up on the stage at the day of the show and expect that you are going to harmonize your orchestra just because you are a good conductor. So that's exactly what we are actually talking to. You've got to be in tune with what is going on in the organization so that you are able to dispense enthusiasm through your committee, through your chairing of the committee. So it's very important that you are in tune with what is going on. Yeah.
Point that. Good analogy. Thank you, Simo. I have a question now. Maybe I'll put this to you, Ntombi. It was actually directed at you, and I think this is a good one for you because you also serve on remuneration committees. Is the wage gap disparity in corporates an ethical issue?
I think it's a business issue. Very simple answer, right? It is a business issue and an ethical issue as well, but I think it's more of a business issue than an ethical issue. Because I think that if we do not address it, we cannot be claimed to be ethical, right? And I must say, I'm basing all what I'm saying on South African ethics gap, not anybody else.
Okay. And we can also deal with more of those questions on remuneration at our next Ask the Experts next month. Okay, a question, and I'm going to ask my panelists to put their hands up for this one. In your experience, do you see social and ethics strategy and deliverables being included in short-term incentive plans and long-term incentive plans?
So do you see each being what?
Do you, in your experience, do you see social and ethics committee strategy deliverables being included in short-term incentive plans and long-term incentive plans?
I think it's already beginning to happen, right? Or it's happening, because I mean, I'm just thinking safety, safety is often an STI issue, right? And safety is a social and ethics issue, so we're talking ESG now. And all the elements that come there, a lot of them are going to be issues that are dealt with under STIs and could be in terms of particularly environmental, the gases and stuff like that. They could be more long-term things, depending on the industry. So I think it's already happening,
Yeah, and it's happening on executive remuneration level, but in some organizations it even goes lower down. It's also included in the scorecards of managers and of ordinary employees. But Julie, it's one of those questions where you can't really say yes or no. If the question is, have you seen examples? Yes, I definitely have seen examples. In my own scorecard, there are a lot of non-financial matters. So if the company is serious and understands what are the key drivers to success, and they realize that a lot of that has to do also with the ethical culture of the organization, with trust in the organization, then it would be irresponsible not to include these issues in the way in which you assess the performance of your executives.
I think also the other element, just trying to link it into remuneration as well. When we talk about malice and clawback, right, which is what a lot of shareholders have been calling for post all the things that have happened in South Africa. What is that about? It's about being able to get back when people have done wrong, and what is that? That's an ethical issue, in my book anyway. If you steal, you must pay back, Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true, Julie. It's there. Obviously, to different levels of emphasis, as Deon was pointing out, based on what is material to your organization. But if safety is material, it's material. If corporate social responsibilities are material, they are material. social issues that are plaguing the organization and need to be resolved. Who's going to do it if you don't send your management, and you must put it in their performance management contracts, that those are the things that they are actually going to deliver. And yeah, so it would really be a miss not to have it in your performance contracting regime.
I have a practical question now. One of our audience members would like to know which management reports will help the Social and Ethics Committee in providing the right level of oversight.
Reports. Okay.
Yeah, it's reports that actually deal with the matters that are on your agenda as a Social and Ethics Committee. Your safety report definitely has to be there, and it actually will have the parameters that help you as a Social and Ethics Committee. Your health management report in the mines, that's very big, very important, where we look, for instance, at dust issues, carbon monoxide issues. So that's very important. Your radiation issues, if you have radiation in your environment, would be very, very important to be included. Then you will go to your employment equity. It's a very important report for the Social and Ethics Committee. You look at your stakeholder management report. It's absolutely important to the Social and Ethics Committee that you know that this is our stakeholder management strategy, this is our stakeholder management plan, and how are we progressing in the implementation of our plan should come through your stakeholder management report. So those reports are very important. Some organizations have ethics reports as well, where you talk about incidents that represent the ethical culture in the organization, theft, corruption, fraud, and all those kinds of things. So yeah, all of those reports are very useful to the Social and Ethics Committee.
Thanks.
Material, tip-offs, all that is,
yes,
all those become part of what is reported into, your training budget, the financial sustainability. In other words, what is that equation that makes you know that your training is worthwhile? It's useful. It's not training for the sake of training.
Yeah. And a lot of these reports that we find traditionally in organizations are relevant to the committee, to this committee and also to other committees, but there also might be gaps. And I'm a strong proponent thereof that the Social and Ethics Committee should not only be receivers of reports. They should also play a role in engaging with management and saying, but there are gaps, for example, in your HR report or in your ethics report. There are things that we would like to know that currently isn't there. So I often find that a committee is frustrated by the information reported to them, but they should not blame management if they haven't expressed their information needs to management. So that is, especially in the early days of a Social and Ethics Committee, an extremely important conversation to have, to say which of the existing reports fulfill the information needs of a Social and Ethics Committee, or are there certain gaps? But sometimes you also get that management only might report compliance. And if something is really material to you, if it's of incredible importance for your sustainability and your performance, then I'm not satisfied with compliance reporting to say, yes, we can tick all the boxes. I'm interested, and I know when it comes to safety and health, it's not about whether you have a policy, whether you have people trained. The question is, have people died? Have people injured? And there you really want performance indicators, not compliance indicators, reported to the committee. And I think it's also important that there are certain trend analyses, that you don't only report this quarter's safety and health incidents, but that you report it over the last 3 quarters or the last 3 years, so that you can see, are we moving in the right or the wrong direction? But all these are things that needs to be stipulated by the committee in a conversation with management about the information needs of a Social and Ethics Committee.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. I have another question here coming in from our audience about the Companies Act, which, so the Companies Act, they're saying is law, and it calls for no less than 3 social and ethics committee members, with at least 1 being an NED. Whereas King 4, which is voluntary to some extent, calls for the majority NEDs. This person personally thinks that they would typically opt for King 4 since it is more balanced. However, will complying with the Companies Act suffice? Now, I think it would be more from your experience and how you have in your committees when you've had more of a majority of NEDs. What has the benefit been for you, or what have you experienced that in terms of it being more beneficial? So, any advice on that, or any experience that you can share on that?
Could I go?
Please.
Or, okay. So I've had the opportunity to be the only NED, the only independent, right? And I've had the opportunity of being one of several others, right? I think that when we're more than one, it's a much more effective committee, right? Because you have more people who've got divergent views being able to share their experience and pour into the cup of the organization, right? And therefore the debate is far more robust than when I sit and I say, this is what I think, and this is what I've seen, right? Just take this conversation here. We all come from different spaces, but it's quite a rich conversation because we're all coming from different places and we're all independent, So imagine if you had just one of us talking in this session, the energy would be very different,
Yeah.
So just for that reason, I would say more than one is the more, I'd recommend that better.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. Probably one of the most fundamental governance principles is that you should never mark your own homework, because we are extremely subjective in marking our own homework, and there are wonderful social experiments who can prove that. And what happens with the Companies Act and the Companies Regulation prescription is that you allow for a situation where you have a majority of managers overseeing management. And that is unhealthy. And that, of course, was the rationale behind King 4 recommending that there should be a mix of executives and non-executives, with the majority being non-executive, because now management no longer is in a position to mark their own homework. And I think this has been taken quite seriously, in fact, too seriously, by the Companies Amendment Bill. Because if you look at what happens there, it basically excludes executives, at least the amendment bill, which is still just a concept, because they basically said that no one involved in the day-to-day business of the company should be allowed to become a member of the Social and Ethics Committee. And I think that is taking it a bit too far, because I find it extremely productive to have at least one member of management, and my preference is always for the CEO to be there, so that you have that conversation between executives and non-executives. So that, because otherwise, if you only have non-executives, they simply don't know enough of what is happening in the company. And especially even if you give them good reports, there are questions that aren't addressed in reports to the committee. You simply need executives in that conversation, either as members or as standing invitees of the committee.
Thanks, Deon. Simo, if there's anything you wanted to add, or I can go on to the next question. Okay, I think my sound's gone again. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, when you talk too close to the previous speaker, we can't hear you. Yeah, I think you'll have to pause a while, yeah.
Thanks, Simo. I was actually asking if you wanted anything to add there, or can I move on to the next question?
Yeah, let me just say this as a generic approach, not necessarily just for the social and ethics. The law is a catch net below which, if you don't comply, you must go to prison by design, But the code is aspirational. What are we aspiring to? We're aspiring to the trust and confidence of our stakeholders, because in essence, that's what corporate governance is about. You want stakeholders that believe and trust and have confidence in the organization and its leadership. So it's very important you consider what will give them trust. Will they be happy that there was just only one non-executive director? I think that might raise a lot more questions than when you have more, generally. So that's what we are looking for. And social and ethics is required for companies that have a public interest score of 500. So they are significant organizations in society, and we want to see their impact in society. So for you to get the trust and confidence, it's important that you tap from as much leadership expertise that you have as possible. So it's best practice. It does not necessarily mean if you don't apply best practice, you must go to prison, but you obviously are not going to reach for the stars. And that's really the differentiator between the two.
Thanks, Simo. Okay, so now we have just come out of the third wave, and when we do have the waves, the levels for COVID go up and down. So one of our questions is, the pandemic has brought to the fore the issues facing our communities and shown that these are to be resolved in collaboration with government. How does the committee respond quickly and with impact whilst keeping ahead with the different levels? Are there any examples that will help? Not a bit of a layered question there, but are there any examples of how the committee has responded to issues within a community, facing communities during this pandemic?
Yeah, one that I know. Oh, sorry, Ntombi, go ahead.
Go ahead, you guys.
Well, one that I know very well is companies have actually provided test facilities for their communities. They are also providing vaccination facilities for their communities, working with government so that you don't go very far to get those vaccines. Mines do that quite a lot because they have to conduct a lot of testing of their, so there's an opportunity in the fight against COVID that a lot of companies are actually taking advantage of to actually create a view of value. I'm also aware of a number of sporting organizations that have made their facilities in the form of stadia available to government to conduct mass vaccinations so that you will still have social distancing in a place that has a lot of space, a lot of crowd control facilities, so that you are actually able to ramp up your vaccination so that we quickly get to herd immunity.
Yeah, I was probably going to add to that and say the mining sector seems to be leading the charge there, right? And really, I mean, it's because they get, a lot of their workforce from a particular area, and generally there seems to be a lot of people around there. But also, I mean, if you think about the discoveries of the world and what they've done, right, in terms of the response to COVID, that has also helped, right? And I think that there's a push at the moment from a lot of corporates to ask governments to allow their sites to be vaccination centers. But obviously there's a whole conversation that goes in there, and a whole process of deciding which are good sites and which are not such good sites because of the requirements, in terms of looking after the vaccination, distributing the vaccination, and actually issuing and, giving the injections, all of that, right, has helped, right? And also there's also the issue of tracking, who's had the vaccination, who hasn't had the vaccination, et cetera, et cetera. So all those things need to come together. But I think that for me, in answering the question sort of generically, I think that the response of corporate, right, has been amazing, right, to this crisis that we are all facing. This is for me, one of those examples where when we work together, we achieve so much more than when we work in our separate societal groups and we have expectations that this is a corporate issue, this is a government issue, this is a, provincial issue, et cetera, et cetera. The more we learn to find ways, the synergies, the better we will be as a society,
Yeah.
And I mean, you look at other nations of the world and see how they've responded. You know, there's the Israeli example where they very quickly, you know, vaccinated everybody, right? Okay, today it's different because now fourth wave is here and maybe they're not as immune as they should have. You look at the example of the United States, you know, change of government and things changed, you know, phenomenally. Today they're walking around without masks, whether that's a good thing or not. But, you know, the point is that they've got a somewhat safer environment, you know. And, you know, and we look at our own government's response, you know. Some of us may criticize and say they were too slow, they did this in the wrong order, etc., etc. But the point is that they have done something other than not doing anything at all, you know.
Thanks, Ntombi.
I think it's so important to understand that any crisis, whether it's a health crisis or a safety crisis or economic crisis, always have a lot of social, ethical, and trust elements to that. And this is really a time for a social and ethics committee, not to take over the job of management, but to say, yeah, issues that are strategically important for our company. And I've seen one company that I work with where in the time of crisis, the social and ethics committee had 14 meetings in 1 year, because really the future of this company did not any longer depend on mineral deposits, but on social deposits of trust and rebuilding trust in the organization. So I know the King Committee issued guidance to boards in general in the time of COVID. At the Ethics Institute, we also issued the guidance specifically to social and ethics committees about the type of things that they should attend to and keep a keen eye on in the time of the COVID crisis.
Thanks, Deon. Thanks, Deon. I appreciate that. I've got a question here. It's a practical question. It's been asked by 2 members of our audience. What is the fixed number of members to serve on the Social and Ethics Committee, and particularly for the purposes of debate? How big should your SEC be to really get the best conversations? Simo, what's been your experience?
Well, generally, I would say no less than 3. But also you don't want a committee that's too big, so 5 probably on the top side. Yeah.
Well, the statutory requirement is a minimum of 3, so you can't go below that if you're required to have it. So that's the minimum. What we saw in the Social and Ethics Committee trend survey is that the average is somewhere between 4 and 5. That's the average size of social and ethics committees. We had 75 organizations who participated in that, and yeah, say 4 or 5 is about the average. But of course, it's not about the number. It's about looking at your mandate and saying, what mix of expertise do we need in our committee in order to have the right conversation? And of course, as I said earlier, it's not only about members, it's also about invitees. So it's about having the right people in the room to really talk meaningfully and mindfully about everything within the mandate of the committee.
Thanks, Deon.
I would just add to say, yes, as committee members, 3, but you'd find that sometimes the meeting, depending on the agenda and the sector, might have a lot of people, because as you know, as Simo was suggested, in the mining environment, you would have to have the air expert, air quality expert. You'd have to have the dust quality expert, the water management expert, you know, the mining expert, you know. So, you know, they would come in as invitees, and, you know, in order to control the numbers, because, okay, now we are online mostly, but in the times when we were sitting in a boardroom, we would often allow those people to come in, do their presentation, do their thing, and go away, right? So that the room is not always full of many people.
Thank you. Okay, one question, one of our audience members is something that one of our audience members is wondering is, should the SEC deal with compliance management related issues? compliance management related issues. Should the SEC
Well,
deal with that?
generally, Julie, compliance management as a discipline is closest to risk, because you've got compliance risks and all of that. But you obviously would have issues of compliance that this committee also looks at. Issues like employment equity, you can't just be naive of what the compliance requirements are, even when you track and you look at your plans, when you look at your reports. So there will be, and as it is in many other committees, issues of compliance in the committee. You also, when you're dealing with your ethics, are dealing with a number of things that will be in your policies, that will be in the law itself. So definitely there is a lot of discussion that has compliance implications and compliance management. And if it also emanates out of your ethics culture, that you suffer from non-compliance. Let's, for instance, say you are being fined left, right, and center by your regulators because your managers are taking shortcuts, and there are elements of trying to benefit themselves, those next to them, or even your stakeholders for that matter. That would become very important. So there's no way you can run away from compliance management.
Yeah, and it's actually written into law, because if you read the mandate, it says the committee should monitor compliance with relevant legislation,
areas,
but also compliance with codes of best practice. So it is written in there that there is a compliance element, but it's not the total compliance function of the organization. It is those relevant legislation that pertains to the specific issues within the mandate of the committee. But that, of course, is also one of the problems of the Social and Ethics Committee, the way in which the Companies Act and regulations have been written, because to a large extent, companies have interpreted their mandate as a compliance mandate. Can we tick the box that we comply with health, safety and health regulations, that we comply with ILO standards on decent work and working conditions, with BEE, with employment equity. And then we miss the point, because then we turn the committee into a compliance structure and not into a governance structure, because governance structures goes way beyond compliance. Yes, they exercise oversight, but it's also about setting strategy and having strategic conversations about how the things within the mandate of the committee contribute to the company fulfilling its purpose and performing in a sustainable manner.
Thank you for that. One of our members would like to know, to what extent does the SEC have oversight of the company's marketing matters? And they asked this question with specific reference to the clicks debacle, which comes with the negative impact that this had on the company's reputation.
I think that first, I'm just talking, I didn't even ask. I think, that's the whole conversation around stakeholder management, right? And fundamentally, the issue of reputation is a managerial and board issue, right? So the Social and Ethics Committee, and I mean, I'm thinking about the clicks thing, because when it happened, H&M issue, all of them, right? When it happened, you say to yourself, where were the guys at the top, right? How do you allow people to use terms like they did in the H&M issue, right? How do you allow those people just to say things like that? How did that advert pass at clicks, right? Who was not thinking, right? What was the composition of the people who made the final decision? What was the ethical culture that is portrayed in the people that actually, or is embedded in the people that made those final decisions? And this is where things like equity come in, employment equity. Because if we're all thinking the same, right, there's no way we'll see when we're doing wrong, right? We need to ensure that we've got different people with different views in it, that they can see different perspectives of the thing. So when you look at it and you say, guys, the same conversation we were having now at the Olympics with the clothes that people are wearing when they participate, you know. I mean, you know, what they're wearing? You know, we're not measuring their clothes, you know, or how they wear their clothes. We're measuring their athletic ability, you know. But you know, it's that conversation. So I do believe that it's a conversation that should happen at social and ethics, but the buck stops with the management and the board when it comes to.
No, I think it's definitely in the statutory mandate, because the whole matter of advertising is something that is mentioned explicitly as one of the things that the committee should monitor, as well as consumer relations is also an aspect that should be monitored. But what I found is that marketing can actually benefit a lot from understanding more about what the Social and Ethics Committee is doing. I recall one incident where I interacted with a pharmaceutical company, and the person responsible for marketing and advertising was there to give his or her report, but they stayed for the entire meeting. And at the end of the meeting, the person said, "Wow, I should be at every meeting because I now get so many new marketing angles. I wasn't aware of how environmentally responsible and social responsible we were, and what we invested in." So it's once again, Simo, as you say, it is traffic in two directions. Also, when it comes to the people reporting into the committee, also getting a deeper insight and a more comprehensive insight in the company as a responsible member of society. And obviously that can flow back also in how you market and advertise your products.
Yeah, you actually would like to see that, Deon, very much so, that the work done by the Social and Ethics Committee contributes, because it has business rationale. It actually positions us as a legitimate company in the eyes of our stakeholders, in the eyes of society. And you'd like to see that marketing actually uses that. But over and above the strategic perspective, in our statutes, you also mandated to actually talk about customer relations. Look, for instance, at trends of customer complaints. Where are the areas where the complaints are growing? What are the issues that are plaguing us in those particular areas? And that feedback should also go back to marketing to help improve the relationships from a positioning point of view on whatever else that marketing helps us with. Yeah, so it's a very important contributor, and it's also a very important conversation that impacts on our marketing environment.
Thank you, Simo. Thank you. I've got two questions that are similar and relate. Well, they're similar in terms of the topic. The question is, how does the SEC draw a line between corporate social responsibility and corporate social investment, considering that an investment has an explicit expectation of return? How does the company balance the responsibility versus the investment, and how does the SEC influence this? This was, again, also touched on in the second question. How can the SEC assist organizations to transition from corporate social investment to corporate social value creation, to invest in, for example, social entrepreneurs? So it's looked like it's a question really asking the balance between corporate social responsibility
investment
and corporate social value creation.
Okay. I think that the first thing is that we need to be understanding what we're doing, right? So corporate social investment, corporate social responsibility, value creation, those are all words that we're using. But what are we actually doing? What is the purpose of what we're doing, extending ourselves beyond our own business? So if we want to invest, let us invest. If we want to be a responsible corporate citizen, let us be a responsible corporate citizen, right? So when you then decide what you're doing, you are moving away from being a charity donor right? Because you could be a donor and just give 100,000 rand and forget about it. Or you're saying, I want to ensure that I'm investing in the future of this society, right? And therefore, I'm going to do the following things. We are going to not only give the 100,000 rand, but we're going to make sure that we're in a mining company or an engineering company. We're going to make sure that we're going to take, piece from this environment. We're going to make sure that at early learning center level, right, we're ensuring that we're exposing the children to numbers, to counting, to analytical skills, so that the base is right, so that they then go to primary school and can count nicely, and they can go to high school and choose additional maths as their subject, and then they can go to UCT and become aeronautical engineers or whatever the story is, and then they can come and work for us, and then we can make sure that these wind farms actually produce electricity because we'll help Eskom, so it's the whole cycle, right? Or are we saying all we're interested in, right, is ensuring that the wind farms work, right, and they've got enough money. So we'll put money into making sure that the wind farm, we pay for the engineer that comes to the wind farm, So we need to decide what it is that we want to do in the first place. So then once we've decided that, then we can decide whether it's an investment or are we acting out of being a responsible corporate citizen. And therefore, I would say we call it corporate social responsibility, right? If you want to create wealth, on the other hand, is the wealth being created for us as the business, or is the wealth being created for the community? So take the wind farms, for instance. There's a lot of communities around those wind farms who have got very little, right? So are we going to then make sure that it's a value creation process that makes sure that the whole community is uplifted, so the economics and the socials of that community are raised up? So we get ourselves involved in the health, we get ourselves involved in the schooling, we get ourselves involved in the social issues that the communities face, because a lot of those communities, you'll find there's all sorts of things, alcoholism, gender-based violence levels are very, very high, etc., etc. So there's a lot of stuff that we can get ourselves into. And often when this conversation has happened in spaces that I've been in, board and management have said, but you know what, we're not in the business of doing that. What is our core competence? And we must focus on our core competence. And my response to that is, yes, your core competence is important. It's important for you to understand it and know it and, continue to safeguard it. But your core competence cannot exist in isolation. It exists in a particular kind of environment. You need to pick. You can't do everything. You can't be jack of all trades. You got to pick what's important, right? Either for yourselves to perpetuate your business, or for the community, because your business will thrive in that community.
Can I follow Julie very quickly? Look, I'm going to try and take it to an extreme. But before I do that, let me just say this. Corporate social responsibility flows right out of your strategy in terms of your core business and what you do. It has to be looked at even at that level, so that you are not an irresponsible corporate, socially irresponsible corporate in terms of your core business, and you try and make up for it with a couple of investments in the social space. So what I mean by that, you can't be a drug dealer and then take the money you make out of selling drugs and go buy a couple of bread, vegetables and meat and do a feeding scheme at a school. So your legitimacy is still going to be questioned. You're still going to be an illegitimate. That's the extreme end of it. So you've got to balance it. Invest in the areas as a socially responsible corporate that are actually going to give the return in terms of that investment. And it's not necessarily a return just to you, it's a return to society, it's a return to the community and the stakeholders. So that's how I see it. That's how it hangs together. So I know I've used what it should not be to illustrate it, but that's the extreme that you don't want to get into. So that's why it's not either or. It actually is complementary.
Jan, you Have anything
No,
to
no,
add?
I totally agree, and I think your biggest responsibility is to deliver on your purpose. Because if you deliver on your purpose as a company, you will create a lot of value for people outside your organization, obviously also for people inside your organization. And I think this whole play between CSR and CSI and corporate citizenship has a lot to do with marketing. And I think often marketing has given CSR a bad name. And that is why there's a shift away from from using the terminology of CSR. In the King report, since King 2, we are referring now much more to corporate citizenship, because it conveys the idea that you are a member of something bigger, whether you like it or not. And you can only prosper if that context of the economy, society, and the environment is also flourishing. If there are big problems there, and climate change is a perfect example, we can invest as a bank or as a finance institution in training a lot of accountants. But if this planet is no longer livable, all these accountants would help us absolutely nothing. So we need to look at, yes, investing in people, but also ensuring that we have a strong, stable economy and that we look after the natural environment. So, and that is an investment into our own future. We need to be totally clear and honest about that this is not an act of selflessness. It is in our own best interest to ensure that we do invest not only in our own people, but also in the stability of our economy, our society, and our environment. And in that sense, it is an investment here.
Can I just add one thing, Julie? This is a very important subject, and it's also important that when we are in these committees and boards, we open our minds and we don't think in a narrow fashion. It's very important that you do what you are set up to do and you deliver on that. But in doing so, you must not pass costs and liabilities to others. That's where the responsibility also comes in. So what has been happening in our business model is we've been focusing on the manufacturing process, the systems that we use, and whether we make money or not. And then we will use that money to go and pay for our sins where we choose to, because we also don't pay where we should. Like Ntombi said, you have wind farms and the community around is not benefiting anything out of that. So what opportunities do you also create for others to prosper out of your value chain? Where there are opportunities in your waste, where there are opportunities in your product, it's still important. And in our environment, which is one of the things that the Social and Ethics Committee is tasked with looking at in terms of the supply chain, your things like your enterprise development, they are not just there for the goodness of your heart. They are actually very important value creation elements that social and ethics committees should apply their minds on. We should know our value chains from cradle to grave and extract every value creation opportunity out of them as we possibly can. Not necessarily to execute it ourselves as a company, but also to create opportunities for others.
Thanks, Simo. Thanks for that. I have someone with their hand up, but before I get to the audience member with their hand up, I want to quickly ask Ntombi. Previously, you mentioned that sometimes the committee is seen as a bit of a catch-all. How would this affect? How does this affect? Does it affect? How seriously does it affect how it is taken by the board and by the C-suite members or within the organization? How would you rate that in comparison to the audit and risk and the remuneration committee?
Excellent ethical question, I would like to put it that way, because I think that part of our problem is related to the socialization around these committees. So the audit committee and the risk committee are often viewed as the clever ones. All the clever people sit in there, and that's that you need to be in. And I mean, even in remuneration contexts, they get paid more than, you know, in a lot of environments, they get paid more than everybody else, you know, because the focus of the corporate is the finance and the sheet, you know, the bottom line must be right. Yeah? But the world is changing. Right? The whole green movement and ESG and all the things that have happened, they have told us that we don't only need to look at the bottom line, we need to look at the triple bottom line. So we're becoming more important. So with time, I do believe that the Social and Ethics Committee will take on a completely different role, right? But it will take time. And we need, as social and ethics members, chairpersons, participants, to ensure that we take the committee further, okay, and actually make sure that the conversations that are happening on the board are conversations that encourage conversations that need to happen at the ethics committee. I mean, I just look at the trajectory. I'm sure Deon will agree with me. 50 years ago, we never talked about ethics, right? 40 years ago, 30 years ago, we never talked about ethics. In fact, in my short-lived life, I think the ethics debate became very big after Enron, right? You know, and everybody's just saying, whoopsie, you know, I think we need to talk about this. You know, before that, people did what they wanted to do. You know, today we talk about it with much more emphasis and, you know, seeking direction, and it becomes a big thing. In the context of South Africa, however, the Social and Ethics Committee is a statutory committee. It is therefore in the law, right? It is therefore as important as the Audit and Risk Committee. And until we get that into the heads of board members, chairmen, CEOs, we will continue to have this sort of, you know, oh, we don't know what to do, that send it to the Social and Ethics Committee. Oh, we've got a board member here who's got a skill that we're not really sure we need it, you know, because we all know we need accountants, right? And in certain environments, we all know we need engineers or lawyers. But who are the specialists in there? You know, it's all these guys who've done social sciences and humanities. We're not really interested in them. They're not part of the business agenda, right? So let's throw them into the Social Ethics Committee. The same attitude in terms of the items that come on the agenda of the board, right? And I think that once we get over that, right, we will then find that the space that social and ethics occupies will be so much more different. You know, if you look at, my last point, if you look at, you know, sort of training requirements and qualifications, right? People tended to look and say those people who had somewhat scientific qualifications or analytical skills were cleverer than those who had social sciences and, you know, and humanities. But today, it is quite clear that the more successful CEOs are not the ones who are specialized in a specific area, but those who've got a much more general qualification and experience. Right? So it will change. It will change. It will just take a bit of time.
Yeah, I think one of the most important conversations for a new Social and Ethics Committee, once you have reconstituted membership, is that conversation about what is our role. We have a specific role in this company. What is that role? And that role obviously must be linked to the performance, the sustainability, and the purpose of the company. If you have that conversation, I find there's interest, there's traction, there's no legitimacy issues then. So incredibly important that we don't see it as, although it's a statutory requirement, that we don't see it as a statutory responsibility. Because if we only want to satisfy the statutory requirement, we then work for our Social and Ethics Committee. And the whole idea is that the Social and Ethics Committee should work for you. And it is incredibly important that Social and Ethics Committee as a collective should understand what is our role. What will will our company, our organization be missing if we are not there? That is very often the easiest way to understand your role. If we disappear overnight, what will have gone amiss in our organization? In other words, what is that unique difference that we can make that no other committee can make, and that is absolutely vital for the success, sustainability, and purpose of this company?
Thanks, Deon. I'm very cognizant that we are running out of time, and I've just got 2 questions. I would like to get 2 more questions in. We've got Paco from our audience who would like to speak. Paco, would you like to go ahead, unmute yourself, and ask your question?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, panelists. And you actually introduced the issue of purpose from the beginning, and I became anxious about something. And then I would like to say you came to that. What was that? That was a division between the shareholders and the corporate in the tsunami disaster. There was the Australian Shareholders Association was complaining that the people who were aiding the victims were treating them disrespectfully because it was just amount to dumping what they were giving up. Now, I believe you have summed up that and say, don't do it at the expense of anyone. Try and balance things, and the 6 capitals and the ESG, that's where they come in. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm not sure if there was a question or a statement. I am going to just quickly, if there's nothing to say, if you have anything in response to that particular statement. Otherwise, I'm just going to try and get to 1 or 2 more questions. I do want to tell all the people who have posed questions, we are going to take note of all those that don't get answered, and we will revert with some answers to you for some of the questions that we don't get to. There's one last question here. How best can the SEC oversee governance of ethics in relation to best practices such as the UN Compact principles, the OECD standards on managing fraud and corruption, etc., to achieve impactful outcomes in an organization? So I think really, how do you incorporate all these other publications and principles into your work?
I think it really comes down to understanding where your organization is ethically speaking. And that's why we like to start with the ethics risk assessment for an organization, to find out what are the things that are going right, but also what are the things that should keep us awake at night and that in the end can do us huge harm. And depending on that, you can then start strategizing for what you want to do and what you want to focus. And that will also determine which of these standards become important to you. If corruption is a big issue, then something like Global Compact Principle 10 would become very important, and there's a lot of useful guidance that is there. But if the issue is about gender or racial discrimination, you would look elsewhere for sources to assist you. But ultimately, and I think this is the very important shift that we saw from King 3 to King 4, because King 3 still talked about the board should look at the effectiveness of ethics management, while King 4 says, no, it's about governing your ethics in a way that supports the establishment of an ethical culture. And I think this is where social and ethics committees often struggle, because they don't have the ability to make a proper assessment of what is our ethical culture, and is our ethical culture moving in the right or the wrong direction. And therefore, it is important that you do assess that. And there are very good instruments around for assessing the maturity of your ethical culture, and also for comparing yourself against other companies so that you can see, yes, our culture is moving in the right direction. Because if your culture, your ethical culture is well established, then a lot of the other controls become much less important, and it contributes to the morale of your staff, to trust in your organization, to creating meaningful work for people, and a whole lot of other benefits. So I personally think it is incredibly important that we have made this shift, not to tick the box. Yes, we have a code of ethics. Yes, we have a whistleblowing system. That's not good enough. Those are all mechanisms for managing your ethics, but does it make a difference in the way in which people behave themselves? And if there's not a difference in that behavior, then you're actually wasting time and resources.
Thanks, Deon. Just to all our audience members, before we sign off, I'm going to put some information up on the next slide, but I've got one more question for you. I just would like to ask you to hang in there until we're finished, because I would like to share some information with you. Last question, how does the SEC play a role of consequence management in respect of executive directors?
A role of consequence management. Obviously, consequence management, you have to know what has been done wrong, and you have to investigate that and then provide consequences. Or you can actually look at it from a performance management point of view, if it's performance related, and then give your inputs in the performance evaluation of that particular executive or executive director. But let's say, for instance, a very serious transgression has taken place. It indicates that there are unethical issues, or there was unethical conduct. You then obviously have to bring it to the attention of the board. As the Social and Ethics Committee, if you've come across that, it will then be taken through the right channels in terms of investigations and whatever that needs to be done. You then also need to review and see if, like Ntombi was saying earlier on, are the issues of malice and clawback that would be applicable in the case of their remuneration incentives or whatever that they've been provided before. And make sure that we do everything in a just and fair manner, which is what ethics boils down to in a broader scheme of things. So you have a role to play in the establishment of the transgression, the reporting of it, how we deal with it, as well as did we actually conduct ourselves in a fair manner, and were we actually ethical in handling of this whole situation at the end of the day.
I think also the other element around that is that often when it's straightforward things like, pure discipline things or pure performance things, it's easy. You can send it to the right committee at the right place. But there are some of the things that fall in between the cracks where nobody is really sure about should we do something about this or not, right? And I think the Social and Ethics Committee plays a role there, right? In saying, guys, this is something that we have to deal with, right? And then let's sit down as a board, let's agree, or let's sit down with management, because sometimes there's issues of confidentiality, etc., where you sit down with management and you say, management, you know what? You guys have got a choice. You either do something about this or not, right? And if you don't, here are the consequences. If you do, here are the consequences, and become the conscience of the organization.
Thanks, everyone. I think we are now officially out of time. But I would like to request from our audience that this is our very first session, and I personally have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I am very grateful to our panel who's given us their time and have joined us to share their experience and their knowledge. We would really like to hear from our audience on this. We will circulate a survey for you to answer on this. Short survey, don't worry, it won't be onerous. We also have a QR code which you could scan and answer the survey now. And I'd also like to let you know that our next Ask the Experts will be on the 25th of August, and it will be on remuneration. And Ntombi, you could have been an expert on that panel, except I think you were definitely a good expert on this panel. So I'd like to thank everyone, both our audience and our panel members, for joining us. And I bid you a good evening, and I'd like to see you at the next session and love to hear your comments on this event and this session. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.